We've all gotten in trouble at some point or another in our lives, but in the 90s, someone got in a lot of trouble for something pretty serious. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. That quote resonates with anyone who's lived through the 90s. Miles, tell us of a time when you got in trouble and you tried to talk your way out of it.
Well, I think it's quite relevant that we mentioned Bill Clinton this week, because I think it's about 15 years since the anniversary. And, you know, being a kid of the 90s, I didn't quite fully grasp what trouble Bill Clinton was in at the time. Because mainly when I was getting in trouble as a kid, it was usually running away from home or riding my bike outside of the block. But no, we were pretty good kids, and I didn't get in too much trouble as a child. We usually worked at the Renaissance fairs in the summer. So usually we'd ride our bikes to the Renaissance fair, but bikes weren't allowed in the Renaissance fair. I lost my bike. Mom asked where your bike was, and I told her the big robotic dragon burned it with fire. So that's my story on how I got in trouble as a kid and how I talked my way out of it.
In the 90s, there was a great debate. Nintendo 64 or PlayStation. Aaron Campos, tell us of your most favorite video game experience.
N64 or PlayStation. I have to say that it was... Thank you. I needed that jump start. It was a veritable renaissance in the video game industry at this time. We had Nintendo 64 that was based on cartridges, and they were limited on their size, and they had no loading times. And then PlayStation enters the arena and says, hey, guess what? We're cooler because we've got better graphics, but we've got to wait 10 minutes to get to that next level because we have to load it. So we weren't allowed to play video games in our house except on the weekends, so it was very regulated by my parents. And of course, that made it that I wanted everything because friends had everything. My favorite video game at the time was a video game that I couldn't have because I had a Nintendo 64. Got it for Christmas like 3 years after it came out because it was cheaper. I wanted Final Fantasy VII. All of my friends were talking about it at school, and it was just the coolest game. You had players with depth. They had round faces, and they weren't flat up against the wall, right, like Mario. That was my favorite video game of the 90s.
Yet another great debate. This time, I'm sure most guys don't know what I'm talking about. Backstreet Boys or NSYNC? Allison Chen, please tell us.
Oh, that's a hard one. Backstreet Boys or NSYNC. In the 90s, I was in college, so I'm a bit older than most of you guys. But I have to say Backstreet Boys. I lived in Japan when I was in college, and I remember riding the trains and having my big, huge Discman and having a few CDs in there and swapping them out. And I was cooler than most of my peers. And so I had mostly alternative CDs in my music options. But Backstreet Boys were one of them, so I would definitely say Backstreet Boys and not NSYNC. Although now I'm a big NSYNC fan, but they're kind of vintage. Thank
you. Now this is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down. Now I'd like to take a minute, just sit right there, and I'll tell you how I became the prince of a town called Bel Air. We all know the intro to that song. Now please tell us of a time when you had to move somewhere new and you were the new guy. Scott for Town.
Scott for Town. A lot of clapping.
You see Jimmy Fallon do Neil Young doing Christian Bale. It's incredible.
Woo! glad to be here. Thank you. Thank you for asking me up here to tell you when I moved to a new place and I had had to be the new guy in town. I've moved all over the country. I've been to Washington, D.C., right when I graduated college. Then I moved to Oregon, a place called Medford, Oregon. Small town, let me paint the picture. I'm in Washington, D.C. with a suit and tie, actually a tux, at a fundraiser. Very next day, get on a plane, fly to Medford, Oregon, hanging out in a barn with two guys that are putting a dirt bike engine into a street bike engine into a quad. And they got mullets, smoking pot, and I'm standing there, what the did I get into? So it took me a little while to get my bearings and to become a Renaissance man and put on the garb of the area, but I finally figured it out, and I was able to grow a mullet, create cool handlebar mustache, and ride a Harley through town. So thank you.
We faced a great tragedy in the 90s, Y2K, otherwise known as the end of the world. No one knew what was going to happen. So please, Craig Goldberg, tell us where you were on New Year's Eve, 1999.
Okay, so in 1996 was the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which basically deregulated telecom services as we know it. I'm a college kid. A friend of mine starts a telecom company, so I start selling telecom services in New York City in 1999. So I'm in Manhattan. Where do you go when you're in Manhattan on New Year's Eve? Times Square, right? Everybody goes to Times Square. You gotta go to Times Square. Have you ever seen this on television? There's people everywhere. It's Y2K. Everybody thinks it's all gonna, my mom's like, you're not going to Times Square. I'm like, no, go to Times Square. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be awesome. So nothing happened. I was in the middle of Times Square with, I don't even know how many million people. So cold. So cold. This is how cold it was like back in the days of the Renaissance. So cold. I was freezing. We drank 40s, and people were throwing up all over the place. It's a really mess down there. It's like a bucket list thing. Who was just there? Somebody was just there. Somebody was just there for New Year's Eve, and they were like, oh, I gotta go. Don't go. Watch on television. You'll be fine. It's enjoyable. Y2K. Nothing happened. I think my watch stopped for like a second. Thank you.